The History of Philosophy, Modern Philosophy, Kant to the Present. Lecture 6.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are now in the 19th century, or have been for the last week or so. In terms of its practical accomplishments, the 19th century, as you know, was one of the great eras in human history. It was a century in which the Industrial Revolution, which has begun in the late 18th century, transformed the face of the Western world and enabled men to achieve, men in the West at least, a standard of living, a standard of wealth that previously had been unimagined. It is a century in which capitalism, at least as near to capitalism as mankind has ever come, swept the civilized world, most particularly in a country which was officially founded only a few decades before the opening of the 19th century, namely America. It was a century in which slavery was abolished in the civilized world and in which there was no world war for almost a century, actually for 99 years, from the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 through World War I in 1914. In short, the 19th century was a century unparalleled in freedom, achievement, capitalism, peace. It seemed at the time to people living then like a century in which human reason was taking control of man's actual existential life and leading him on to an era of endless progress. If you hear reports from people living prior to World War I, they tell you of the sense that they had that human beings would eternally progress, the sense of optimism, the sense of security, the sense that they lived at last in a fully civilized world. And the people who write about this period say that anyone born since World War I has no idea at all what that sense and attitude toward life was like. You know, however, that the nature and the fate of a civilization is determined by the content of its philosophy. That if reason and individualism and capitalism perish philosophically, that is to say at the hands of philosophers, in not too long a time they will perish culturally and existentially as well. And of course you live in the 20th century, you know what it's like. You know about the spread of unreason and mysticism, of collectivism, of barbarism, of totalitarianism. The question on your mind should be, why? What happened in philosophy in the 19th century to produce such an effect in the 20th? What happened in 19th century philosophy to derail the 19th century and lead us to our present state? Now, we've seen part of the story in the last few weeks. We've been concentrating on Germany, on such philosophers as Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, to mention just those three. We saw Hegel and Marx abandon the law of contradiction in favor of the dialectic process, preach a rampant collectivism and state worship. If we just mention Nietzsche, he was apolitical, as we've seen, insofar as he defended individualism such as it was. His defense was inextricably mixed with romanticism, irrationalism, voluntarism, and undefined loose talk about a quest for power, the exaltation of the passions, the Dionysian element, and so on. Now you may say, surely some other countries saw the greatness of the 19th century's achievements and came to their defense in a rational way. Surely there were advocates of reason, science, and capitalism somewhere in philosophy during this century, even if we couldn't find them in Germany. And the answer to that question is yes, there were advocates of science and capitalism, but what advocates they were. If you want to understand the demise of a viewpoint, an idea of philosophy, there's two things to do. One is to look at the group who attacks it, and the other is to look at the group who defends it. It's bad enough to have one group blatantly attacking fundamental philosophic truths, but that would be limited in its effects if there was someone to answer the attacks and to defend the valid principles by a rational means. But if you combine one stream of philosophers launching an overt attack against reason, capitalism, and individualism, with another group who defend, allegedly, reason and capitalism, but defend them grotesquely, then you have a situation, a combination in which the demise of those principles is inevitable. It's as though you have the ADA, if we take a narrow political analogy, on one side pushing its political program, and the only answer to it is the NAM on the other side. You can see from that combination what would happen to capitalism. So tonight we're going to complete our story of the demise of the 19th century by looking at the prominent 19th century figures in France and England who claim to be defenders of science. We're going to look at first Auguste Comte, then John Stuart Mill, and I'm going to toss in for the same price Jeremy Bentham, his philosophical sidekick who always goes along with him, and then we'll look briefly at Herbert Spencer. They were all staunch defenders of reason and science, they claimed, and all of them except for Comte claimed to be staunch defenders of laissez-faire capitalism. If there's any hope of saving the world from the tide of irrationalism and statism generated in German philosophy, it lies in these men. When you see how they defended these principles, you won't be surprised by the demise of reason that's characteristic of our century. Now, I'd like to just mention in advance that while in the 19th century all the men we're going to treat this evening were considered to be very important figures, today they are validly considered to have comparatively little importance. A man like Auguste Comte, for instance, usually gets a few pages in a history of philosophy today. His main claim to prominence today is that he's an ancestor of the 20th century movement named logical positivism, which built on his conclusions and which we will look at in a few weeks. Herbert Spencer, although he was one of the most famous 19th century philosophers, is usually omitted now from most histories. And John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, a little more important, but they are still minor figures. Their main claim to fame was they popularized a secular version of Christianity, of the Christian ethics known as utilitarianism, which we will look at tonight. All of these, in short, are minor figures. There have been no major philosophers, if you talk in terms of originality and comprehensive systems, since the time of Kant and Hegel. Consequently, I'm not going to make any attempt to give a detailed exposition of these people. They do not merit the time that would take. I'm going to indicate a few characteristic points for each, sufficient to give you an indication of the type of ideas they preached. Just enough for you to see why, if these were the defenders of reason, science, and capitalism, they're doomed. And let's begin with Auguste Comte, that's C-O-M-T-E, 1797 to 1857. Now, Comte claimed to be a great advocate of science. He was opposed to Kant's idea of an unknowable noumenal world. He was opposed to Hegel's idea that there is this super absolute evolving dialectically. Both Kant and Hegel, he said, make our world, the world we actually experience, just an appearance or manifestation of something behind the scenes, something beyond any possible experience. And Comte wants, above all, he says, to be scientific, not mystical. This is true at least of the early Comte. He turned mystical late in life, but at least at this point in the presentation, he wants to be scientific. He wants to be an empiricist, to say that all knowledge is based on sense experience. Now, you may say, well, that sounds promising. Maybe he was influenced by Aristotle. Maybe he carved out a rational interpretation of empiricism, showing how we could build up the edifice of human knowledge on the basis of sense experience. If you have any such expectations, I tell you at the outset, they are doomed to disappointment. Who was the last great empiricist in the history of philosophy? David Hume. And Comte picks up where Hume left off. His philosophy is essentially a continuation of Hume's, simply an attempt to apply Hume's conclusions to the interpretation of science. He accepts all of Hume's basic conclusions. He's an arch nominalist. In other words, there's no objective foundation for concepts. He's an arch sensualist. Man can know only sense data, only what is given to him in direct experience. The world man knows for Comte, as for Hume, consists of floating sensory qualities. You remember those floating atomic qualities, or sense data as they call them. Red, rough, hot, cold, green as they come by. You can know that, but that exhausts the universe. The universe is simply a stream or procession of sense data. Now, what does that mean, putting it negatively? Well, to begin with, we dispense with the idea, just to jump in at a certain point, we dispense with the idea that man has a self, or a soul, or a mind, or a consciousness. Why do we dispense with that? Well, let's go back to Hume for a moment, because I didn't present this point, and Comte's conclusions on this are just a continuation of Hume's. Hume had, in the process of developing his philosophy, turned to the question of the self, the I, the ego, the mind. Is that everybody's talking about this self, which we're supposed to have inside ourselves. I want to know what it is. I want to introspect, said Hume, and see if I can perceive this self, which everyone is talking about. Now, what is it supposed to be that I'm to look for, said Hume, before I perform my experiment of looking in and trying to catch it? Well, the self, the I, the mind is supposed to be something distinct from my experiences, my thoughts, my wishes. It's supposed to be the thing which has the experiences, which does the thinking, and so on. And according to its advocates, it's supposed to be something unchanging, something which remains the same across time and is the source of our personal identity. After all, our various thoughts, experiences, emotions constantly change. But our basic I, or ego, or self is supposed to go on across time. It's supposed to be unchanging. Well, says Hume, all I have to do then is look in and see if I can catch by direct introspective means this unchanging ego, or I, or self-consciousness which goes on across time and which is distinguished from all my experiences. And now I'll let Hume speak for himself here. This is his report of what he found when he looked in to see if he could find a self. And he says, quote, "For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and can never observe anything but the perception. If anyone upon serious and unprejudiced reflection thinks he has a different notion of himself, I must confess I can reason no longer with him. All I can allow him is that he may be in the right as well as I, and that we are essentially different in this particular. He may perhaps perceive something simple and continued, which he calls himself, though I am certain there is no such principle in me." This is, of course, sarcasm on Hume's part. "But setting aside some metaphysicians of this kind, I may venture to affirm of the rest of mankind that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement," unquote. In other words, for Hume, the idea of a self is a meaningless term. Because, remember, a term is meaningful only if it stands for something you can directly experience, and the self stands for nothing you can experience. All Hume found when he introspected is a collection of individual experiences, a Heraclitean flux of thoughts and feelings and experiences, etc., succeeding one another. That's all he found. That's all he says we can say there is. There's no such thing then, there's no meaning to saying there's an unchanging I or you which has the experiences or underlies them. You're just simply a flux of changing experiences. This is known sometimes as the bundle theory of the self, because the self is just a bundle a fleeting flow of experiences. Now, before we go back to Comte, I can't resist just in a few words indicating what is wrong with this type of argument. Ask yourself what, after all, is the self that these philosophers all look for and claim they can't find. Actually, of course, our self is our consciousness, our faculty of awareness, the entity that perceives reality. Now, what is it that Hume and Comte and all these people want? They are upset because they never find pure consciousness. They always find that you're conscious of this particular thing or that particular thing or some other particular thing. They never perceive simply consciousness as such. They always perceive consciousness with some content. And since the content is always changing, they claim I never can perceive an unchanging pure consciousness. And therefore the whole thing is a myth. Well, what do they want? They want to perceive consciousness without any content. And of course that you will never do. By the very nature of consciousness, since it's a faculty for perceiving existence, for perceiving some object or content, a consciousness which is conscious of nothing, a so-called pure consciousness, is simply a contradiction in terms. If you ask me that, how then do we arrive at the awareness of our consciousness or self as distinct from its changing content, its changing objects, the answer can only be by a process of abstraction, by conceptual means. You have to abstract away the various contents of consciousness at any moment, and you can then form conceptually the recognition of the entity which is conscious. You have to ignore the contents and arrive at a conceptual awareness of the faculty of consciousness as such, that which does the thinking, draws the conclusions, feels the emotions, etc. But of course, consciousness can't exist in fact except as the consciousness of something. And therefore you can't hope to perceive consciousness except as the consciousness of something. If you deny conceptual knowledge, however, if you deny man's capacity for abstraction, then of course you will never find an enduring self-same consciousness or self. You'll only find a string of conscious experiences like Hume did. You'll always capture consciousness occupied with some content or other. And since the content is always changing, you will then moan and groan, where is the unchanging I? Where is my personal identity amidst this flux of experiences? When in fact the answer is very simple. You do directly experience your I, your consciousness, but in order to identify it and defend its existence, you have to reach the conceptual level, a level to which Hume and his followers on principle never ascend. Well, this is essentially the Comtean view also. The self is simply a bundle. Consciousness can't be grasped by sensualist type means, and therefore there is no such thing as a soul, a self, a mind. If you believe in those things, you merit the ultimate epithet of reproach from Comte, namely, you are metaphysical. If you believe in a mind or a self or a consciousness. Metaphysical for Comte is a term of reproach. Because what is a metaphysician supposed to be? A metaphysician is somebody who is supposed to study the nature of reality and to discover it by conceptual means. The crucial questions of metaphysics cannot be solved or answered strictly on the perceptual level by direct sense experience. And this is true of any type of metaphysics. Whether there's a God or not, you cannot resolve that question by sense experience. Whether there's a law of cause and effect or not, you obviously can't establish that by sense experience. So in metaphysics, we talk about the type of questions that can only be resolved by conceptual means. We attempt to give a description of reality arrived at by rational conceptual means. Well, for a sensualist like Comte, this is an impossible undertaking to begin with, because there's no such thing as a conceptual as distinct from a sensory or perceptual knowledge. Therefore, for him, metaphysics as such must be abandoned. Well, what sort of consequences does that have? Well, suppose you ask Comte a question like this: is there any reality that exists underneath our experiences, apart from our experiences, outside of simply our experiences. Here again, he takes essentially the Humean view. So let's go back for a moment, see what Hume did on this type of question. I should tell you that for centuries prior to Hume, philosophers had held that we never directly perceive reality, we only perceive the effects of reality on us after reality has been processed by our sensory apparatus. And they said if we had different kinds of sense organs, the kind of experiences we would have are different. We're at the end of the chain, we only get reality after it's been processed by our experiences. Consequently, they said we have no direct awareness of or access to the external world. Nevertheless, prior to Hume, these philosophers believed there was an external world out there. It's just that we happen to be trapped in our own minds contemplating our own experiences. Now Hume came along at this stage, accepted the premise that all we experience are our own experiences. That's all we're directly aware of, and proceeded to apply his theory of meaning in order to obliterate the very concept of external reality. Hume says, what do we mean by such a phrase as external world, external reality? Well, he says the people that use this kind of phrase claim that they mean by it something distinct from our experiences. External reality is supposed to be something that's different from simply our experiences. And it's supposed to be something which continues in existence even if no one experiences it. Something which is there independent of our experience. Well, now we simply ask, can such a characterization have any meaning to a human being? Remembering the theory of meaning, which tells us that a phrase is meaningful only if we can have sensory experience of what it refers to. Well, can you perceive something distinct from your experiences? Well, not if you accept the premise that all you perceive is your experiences. You obviously can't perceive something distinct from your experiences. Therefore, for Hume, the phrase, something distinct from our experiences, must be a meaningless term. Something unperceivable, it simply is gibberish, it simply is noise. Well, what about the idea of something existing when you're not perceiving it? Well, you simply ask, can you perceive something existing when you're not perceiving it? Well, obviously, you can't perceive it existing when you're not perceiving it, because if you're perceiving it, you're perceiving it. You'll be trying to look, for instance, at this microphone when you're not looking at it. Well, you can only look at it when you're looking at it, see? And therefore, you can't have any experience of something existing apart from your experiences. And consequently, the phrase existing apart from experience must be also meaningless. Well, if that's what the external reality is supposed to be, something distinct from our experiences and something which continues in existence when we're not experiencing it, then the whole phrase must be meaningless, and we throw out the whole idea of an external world or an external reality. Now, if at this point you're tempted to say to Hume, but look, if you simply analyze what's inherent in the concept of existence, identity, consciousness, you realize that existence exists, that it must be what it is, independent of consciousness, and I see you smiling. Hume will say to you, what do you mean, the concepts of existence and consciousness? What are you talking about? What we've got to work with, our cognitive apparatus, is sense, perceptions, period. And of course, their faint derivatives, namely images. If you don't perceive something, you cannot talk about it. So much for the external world. And in Comte's view, since we only perceive our experiences, we only perceive the sense data going by, a reality independent of us would be unperceivable, and therefore we must throw it out, throw out the idea. We can be certain of our experiences, and that's all. If you believe in an underlying reality, that is metaphysical, and that, of course, is synonymous with low and bad. Well, we're confronted then with a stream of sense experiences. You ask, are there any causal connections in this stream of sense experiences? Are they at least bound together by laws? And of course, the answer to that question for Comte is no. We have no, remember the Humean point, we have no experience of one thing necessitating another. We have no experience of necessity. Therefore, we have no experience of causal connection, and consequently we have to, if you concede cause and effect as being that each event is necessitated by a preceding, that's out also. That also is metaphysical. Now you'd think this is about as negative as a philosophy can get. It's a thorough type of skepticism. So maybe you won't be surprised to know that Comte called this philosophy positivism. He coined the term positivism to stand for a number of reasons which are not too important. One of them, for instance, is that positive means concentrating on the real, and he thought he was concentrating on what's really real, namely sensory facts. For another, because he thought we could be positive in the sense of certain that we do experience individual sense data and what they are. In other words, he was willing to stick his neck out and say that if I hold my hand up and you see a beige patch, you can be entirely certain, see, that you experience that beige patch, or you can be certain of that, you see, and therefore that qualified him to say that he was an advocate of certainty, at least on that level, and thus another strand of why he calls it positivism. That, however, is all that you can be positive of. Everything else, reality, self, causal connections, is a mystical construction which has to be dispensed with. The universe is just a stream of sense data. Now you might ask me, is Comte then an idealist? Does he believe that only minds and their experiences exist? And the answer is no. Idealism is a metaphysical position, and he rejects metaphysics. There's no minds either. There's only a procession of sense data. So he says he's certainly not an idealist. Well, suppose you asked him this question. Does sense data, at least, exist when no one is perceiving them? Do the sense data that we have, are they there independently of us? Well, he himself is very unclear about this. You can find passages in which he seems to say yes and passages in which he seems to say no. His later followers, however, give a very clear answer to that question. They say that's a metaphysical question. And you can't solve that question by sense experience. There's no way by sense experience, as we indicated, to know whether something is there when you're not looking at it. Consequently, they simply say, and we'll see this technique adopted in full when we get to logical positivism, they simply say that type of question is meaningless. We don't say there is anything independent of us, and we don't say there isn't anything independent of us. Both sides are gibberish. That's a metaphysical question. You see, if you're a sensualist, the only questions you can validly ask are those you can settle by direct sense experience. If you can't, you just throw them out as meaningless. And so we're going to start seeing developing across the next weeks as we continue this approach to philosophy, the technique of, instead of answering questions, you simply get rid of them by dismissing the question as a pseudo-question, as a meaningless question. Well, I said Comte is a great champion of science, and you might want to know what can science accomplish in a world such as Comte describes it to be. Can it explain why things take place as they do? Why the procession of sense data follow in the order that they do? And of course the answer to that question is no. On this, Comte is very clear. To explain, to try to offer an explanation of a particular occurrence would mean telling you what the cause is, and causality is already abandoned. If you ask why something occurs according to Comte, you are asking an invalid question. You have the old-fashioned idea, you see, the pre-Humean idea, if you ask that question, that one thing makes another occur, that one thing necessitates another, that you could hope to discover some logical connection between the two. You could discover why one followed from the other. But of course, in the Comtean universe, you cannot hope to find any such causal explanation. What can the sciences do then, according to Comte? Well, they can describe the procession of sense data. They can describe how they actually occur, which package of sense data follows which package, but they never can say why. That's all that's open to a sensualist. Simply give a description of the trotting by sense data as they go by. Now, the ideal for Comte is to generalize the descriptions of science, to find certain regularities, what Hume called certain repeated conjunctions. Certain sense data go by in certain patterns. And hopefully we'll find only a few very general formulas, he said, that will encompass everything that we had observed. But of course we can never hope to understand why the general descriptive laws that we arrive at hold in reality. The behavior of the universe is simply a brute, unintelligible fact. The most we can hope to do is describe how it actually, as a matter of brute fact, operates, never why things are that way. Here's a summary of this point from one commentator. He says, science, according to Comte, can arrive at general descriptive laws. Quote, these laws, however, are not regarded by positivistic science as governing and determining the behavior of the sensible world. They are not the causes of things. As long as science considers them such, it has not as yet risen above the metaphysical level. Natural laws are no more than descriptions of how phenomena do behave. They are not explanations of why they behave as they do. Why things behave as they do is something we cannot know. The causes of things are unascertainable. This is true not only with respect to the why and wherefore of the universe in general, but with respect to each particular phenomenon occurring in sense experience. It follows that science, on its positivistic level, is not in any way concerned with discovering the causes of events. Unquote. And I can give you still a further reason why, for Comte, science can't hope to explain what happens. If you observe the course of any developed science, you will see that at some point, when the scientist attempts to explain the data that he observes, he always has to go beyond the directly given in sensory terms and infer underlying entities that he cannot directly observe, but which he hypothesizes as the causes of what he does observe. And you'll see that trend in all of the advanced sciences. Explanations are offered, for instance, explanations of observed phenomena are offered by appealing to things like atoms, electrons, cosmic rays, energy, gravitational forces, magnetic fields, etc. Now, you cannot observe, you cannot have sensory experience of these phenomena. You cannot see an electron, taste energy, touch a gravitational field, etc. There is no sense data of these type of things. Now, the old-fashioned metaphysical, pre-positivistic type of scientist, the pre-Humean type of scientist, had said, true enough, we can't observe these things, but we infer their existence from what we do observe. These things we hypothesize as the underlying cause of what we experience. But Comte's later followers said, we must dispense with all unobservables. These things are just as bad, just as metaphysical as Kant's noumenal world. If reality is defined in terms of a procession of sense data, then there can be no such things as unobservable entities. Therefore, scientists on this view of science cannot appeal to or hypothesize any such things as electrons, atoms, gravitational forces, cosmic rays, etc. In a word, on this view, to believe in the electron is just as mystical as believing in the noumenal world. Science on this view can never get beneath the surface appearances of things. In fact, things are their surface appearances, and that's all there is to them. Hence, all science can do is describe the unintelligible. It can discover patterns in it and generalize those patterns, and that's it. Now, I should mention here, let you know there's one famous point. According to Comte, this view of science represents the climax of man's intellectual development. According to him, mankind has evolved or developed intellectually according to a law which he made famous, a law which requires that mankind passes through three stages of thought, three basically different methods of thinking. The earliest and the lowest phase is what Comte calls the theological stage of thought. That's the most primitive type of thought, in which human beings try to explain the universe by appeal to divine principles, to gods. In other words, they appeal to arbitrary, supernatural, more or less personal, anthropomorphic type of entities. Well, that's the lowest stage for Comte. But at a certain point, the race progresses, he says. It reaches the second, a higher stage. And by no means still the best, of course, but at least higher, and that's what Comte calls the metaphysical stage. At this stage, men dispense with appealing to gods, but what do instead? They use abstract concepts, abstract principles to try to understand the world. And they still make reference to something beyond sense data. Now, if you ask me more particularly what does Comte mean by the metaphysical stage of thought, I'd have to say it's a giant hodgepodge. It includes what he classifies as metaphysical, in effect, everything that is neither overtly religious and theological, or, on the other hand, blatantly Humean and sensualistic. He would say, for instance, Kant's noumenal world is metaphysical, but the law of cause and effect is metaphysical, and the belief in subatomic particles is metaphysical. In effect, the whole intellectual territory between God and Hume is written off as metaphysical. And then, of course, after we suffer through the metaphysical stage, we reach the final stage, of which Comte claimed to be the prophet, the culmination of human intellectual development, and that is the positivistic stage. At this point, man reaches full intellectual maturity for the first time. In other words, he becomes a complete Humean. He rejects everything apart from sense data and confines himself to a description of the passing sense data. This is the stage of positive science. Now you may ask me, what is the value of scientists finding general patterns in sense experience? Even if he found them on this philosophy, what's the point? And Comte's answer is, well, the scientist will then be able to predict the future, because he knows there are general patterns governing the procession of sense data, and once he can predict the future, well, he knows what steps to make to control it and to determine the future course of events. You say to Comte, but how do you know that the patterns that held true up to now will hold true tomorrow, since you dispense with the law of cause and effect? What about Hume's problem of induction? How can we justify generalizing, since it's just a brute fact that there have been certain regularities up to now? Comte immediately answers, well, of course, we can't claim that the generalizations we reach are absolutes, because to know for certain, we'd have to observe every single instance of the law, and since there's an endless number of instances, we could never do it. But, he says, the generalizations that scientists reach have nevertheless got a certain degree of probability. Why do they have even a degree of probability on this viewpoint, since it's all just simply blind, unintelligible, brute, contingent patterns? Why is there even one chance in a million that the sense datum we call the sun will show up again tomorrow? Comteans have no answer to that at all. Well, that gives you a ringing defense of science's ability to comprehend reality. This is one of the major 19th century defenders of science. We'll see the development of this particular view when we get to the school of logical positivism, which essentially took over the Comtean view and added to it a theory that logic is a matter of how human beings use language. But we'll look at that subsequently. Now I want to say something about Comte's ethics and politics, briefly. Comte was very much concerned about the clash between science and religion. A clash, as you probably know from other sources, which agitated the 19th century considerably. Science was making enormous strides, enormous progress, and in the process it was undermining traditional religious views. And along with it, it was undermining the code of traditional religious values by which men had lived. And Comte, observing this spectacle, the breakdown of old, established, venerable moral standards, and the moral chaos that it generated, Comte decided that something had to be done. He decided he was going to resolve the clash and provide a new, this worldly code of values by which men could live. Now you might ask me, well, did his solution consist of dispensing with religion and arriving at a rationally demonstrable code of values? And you should know, you should be able to guess that the answer to that question is certainly not. First of all, of course, as a human, you couldn't hope to do this, because all you observe is the procession of sense data. You can observe what is the case, but you can't observe what ought to be the case. Remember the is and the ought, and therefore, confined to the level of sense data, you cannot generate any code of values. And there's still another reason why, according to Comte, we could not formulate a rational code of values. Later in his life, Comte came to conclude that reason, logic, intellect, intelligence are not enough to guide human life. As to be sure they are certainly not if you construe them in a positivist fashion. In any event, he came to hold man is moved basically by, guess, his feelings, his emotions, his passions. Therefore, he said a code of values which will really move and guide man must appeal to this elemental, emotional, passional feeling side of human nature. Now, this should remind you of the phenomenon of romanticism that we discussed last week, this emphasis on the primacy of feeling and passion in man, and there's a progressively strong element of that in Comte as he grew older. Now, it's precisely in this he thought that we could find the real value of old-fashioned religion. However much we object to religion, he says, and of course it's theological and therefore as such we can't accept it, but nevertheless, he said, traditional religion performed a vital service because it gave man an external powerful being to engage and stimulate his feelings. It told him there is this magnificent, perfect, all-powerful being, and you should love him, worship him, serve him, feel small before him, feel awe for him, feel reverence for him. Well, that, says Comte, was the great service that traditional religion offers us, and this is what modern man still needs. We cannot, therefore, throw out religion as such. We need some object of religious worship, something that will enlist men's blind, irrational passions and thereby give them an even keel again on which to live their lives. They'll orient their whole lives around a new religion. Now I say a new religion because the old ones are no good. They're theological, metaphysical, they refer to supernatural gods and immortal souls and heaven and hell, etc. None of that is positivistic. So that particular type of religion is out. So we now confront this problem. We've got to have a deity. We've got to have a religion to enlist our passions. But it has to be a this worldly, secular, observable deity. It has to be a deity compatible with science and positivism, as Comte construes science. We have to have what he calls a positivist religion. Well, you ask, who or what will be the deity? Now, Comte gives no arguments for this view, so I'll give you a clue as to what is behind his answer. You recall what Kant's main achievement, I use that word in quotes, was in metaphysics, namely to secularize the religious view, the primacy of consciousness view. The religious people had held prior to Kant that the world is a creation of God's consciousness, and Kant came along and said the world, at least the phenomenal world, is not a creation of God's consciousness, but of human consciousness, of mankind's collective consciousness. What Kant did metaphysically, and we mentioned this when we were discussing Kant, was to place collective human consciousness metaphysically in the position that God had been. Well, what Kant did to metaphysics, Comte did to ethics. He decided to put man collectively in the place of the old-fashioned supernatural God. We cannot, he says, worship any longer a cosmic supernatural being. That's not allowable on positivistic grounds. But we still have to blindly worship something. Well, what? The answer is humanity. That's with a capital H if you're taking notes on Comte. In other words, Comte's contribution to this worldly code of values consists of secularizing the traditional religious ethics. You're supposed to have the same type of emotional attitude that the earlier religionists had to God, the same sense of service, of love, of veneration, of reverence, of awe, of obedience, but now you're to direct it not to a super God, but to humanity as a whole. Now, if you say to me, but humanity isn't an entity, it isn't a being, it's just a group of individuals, I will tell you, of course, that means you forgot Hegel, you forgot Marx, you forgot Plato. Mankind as a whole, according to Comte, is a collective entity, a giant organism. The individual is simply a cell or a fragment of this giant organism. This is a view he accepted fully. The result is we're going to have a religion of humanity. He himself refers to humanity as le grand être, the great being. And here is a description from one commentator. Quote, Comte, having rejected God, along with theology and metaphysics, was forced to recreate an object to worship and to serve acceptable to his positivism. He felt a need of an external being whom man might adore and whose will he might do. In this supreme being, or grand être, he found in humanity as a whole. Mankind is the true God of the individual man, the great being whom he should seek to serve and whose perfection he should endeavor to ensure. We should love humanity with all our mind and heart and strength and seek to do its commandments. We should love our neighbors as ourselves. This religion, like all others, demanded outward symbols and forms. It had to have its clergy. To provide them, Comte adapted the sacraments and the ritual of the Catholic Church and instituted a priesthood. This, mind you, is by the arch 19th century advocate of science. Chapels were, I continue the quote, chapels were acquired in which services were held. Comte seems even to have dreamt of a kind of theocracy. His clergy, chosen for their character, their intellectual attainments, and their knowledge of human nature and its problems, were to direct the life of the positivist state. They were to oversee education, compose quarrels, and advise the rulers, as well as to perform their specifically priestly functions as ministers of the publicly established cult of the great being, humanity, unquote. Now it occurred to Comte to coin a term to designate the proper attitude that you should have. The essence of the proper ethical attitude, your attitude to this great being, the attitude which consists of putting this great being above yourself and of having toward this great being exactly the attitude that a medieval mystic had toward God. And what better term for it than to take the word alter, meaning from a Latin Greek derivative other, and simply coin a term otherism. And out came altruism as the official name which he designated for this viewpoint. The idea essence of altruism is you should place others, humanity, above yourself and sacrifice yourself for the great being. Here is a brief further summary of this point. Quote, "The dignity of the individual is based on the fact that as a member of smaller or larger circles, family, fatherland, etc., he becomes incorporated in the grand être. All thoughts and actions should be directed towards the preservation and perfecting of this being. Altruism," Comte's actual phrase was vivre pour autrui, to live for others, you see. "Altruism is at once the highest duty and the highest blessedness," unquote. And this commentator goes on, 3 sentences I must read you just to give you one further aspect. Quote, "Comte even gives a sketch of the constitution of its future state." Now get this next sentence, quote, "The idea of right must altogether disappear. No one possesses any other right than that of doing his duty." Now that's pretty clear cut. Comte says somewhere that the idea of individual rights is simply metaphysical. That's an abstraction. We are here being very concrete, you see. This commentator goes on, "Individuals are not regarded as separate beings, but as so many organs of the great being," unquote. Now, we may ask, will you have any freedom at all in this positivist theocracy? And in essence, the answer, I think you can guess, is no. You will be free to serve humanity, as directed, of course, by the scientist priests in charge, of whom the high priest is, of course, Comte. Only a few specially trained people can acquire the wisdom to know how humanity is to be served. As one final commentator summarizes this point, quote, "Above all, there must be the supremacy of the intellectual elite, since the technical problems of administering a complex society can be understood only by specialists. For this reason, Comte thought it was just as senseless to permit free inquiry by the masses, to permit free inquiry or discussion about matters of social and political administration by the masses, as to allow them to voice their opinions about some technical matter in chemistry, a field in which they lack proper information, and therefore Comte called for the abolition of the, quote, vagabond liberty of individual minds, unquote. Unquote, both quotes. He called for the abolition of the, quote, vagabond liberty of individual minds. Now that, I think, is pretty clear. Here he's obviously, blatantly influenced by Plato. If you recall, or have heard of Plato's theory of the philosopher king, that only a very few particularly trained, wise individuals, the philosophers, can acquire the ultimate knowledge necessary to know how to live and guide the masses of men, and therefore they should be made kings, absolute dictators over the state. Comte is simply adapting this view within his positivist framework. And he worked out in detail all the trappings of a religion. He took the Roman Catholic Church as his model and simply secularized its various trappings in detail. He worked out a whole calendar of saints, substituting largely great scientists for the religious ones. He had his special festivals and symbols, special banners, if I remember correctly, green and white were the color of the banners. If you're interested in the details of that, I refer you to something called the Catechism of the Positive Religion, which is a book by Comte, which will give you all you could ever want to know about. Now, all of this is advanced by an arch defender, I may say, of science. That is essentially France's contribution to stability in the 19th century. Let's take a break and then we'll see what Britain was doing. All right, now let us turn to British philosophy, and specifically to Jeremy Bentham, Bentham, who was 1748 to 1832, and John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. It's very common in presentations of philosophers to treat these two together because they're both arch laissez-faire capitalists. That's true of Mill, at least early in his career. And they both belong to the same ethical school, which was the basis that they used to defend capitalism, namely utilitarianism. Bentham coined the term utilitarianism, and he gave the first influential statement to that theory. Mill then picked it up from Bentham with a few alterations of his own, and it's been a very popular ethical theory since that time. In our presentation of the ethics of utilitarianism tonight, I'll largely follow Bentham, as is commonly done. But Bentham himself has comparatively very little to say on metaphysical and epistemological questions. He's primarily an ethical political philosopher. So I want to indicate first, by reference to Mill, a few brief examples from Mill's Metaphysics and Epistemology, simply to give you an idea of the sort of foundation which was characteristic of the utilitarians on which they based their ethics. Mill is, along with Bentham, of course, an empiricist. And by now, you should know when you hear that he's going to be a nominalist. That's not a law of nature, but it's pretty much a law of history of philosophy since the modern age. And there's a strong streak of positivism in Mill. He very much admired much of Comte. In general, therefore, he is skeptical of finding metaphysical answers to any of the major questions of philosophy. All we know, he says, is our experiences, and what things in themselves are like, even whether they exist or not, that we cannot know. Now, he says at one point that we all have a strong feeling that there must be a reality causing our experiences, but we can't prove that this feeling is valid, and therefore, for practical purposes, reality is simply the stream of our experiences. And this is essentially the Humean Comtean positivist viewpoint. Now, you may again ask the question, well, does Mill then deny that there are any external material existence independent of consciousness? Is he saying a thing exists only insofar as we perceive it? There was a famous British empiricist named Bishop Berkeley who put forth the view, esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived. And his idea was, if you weren't looking at the back of your head and no one was looking at the back of your head, then it didn't exist. It only existed while it was being perceived. Of course, in his case, he had a God since he was a bishop, and he said, you don't have to worry because God is always looking at the back of your head. But what is Mill's view on this question? Does he believe that there's any such thing as matter independent of consciousness? To which his answer is, in effect, yes and no. Let me try to make this briefly intelligible. For instance, consider this room in which we're in. Now, we all have a stream of sensations. Now, suppose we all leave the room. Has the room vanished? Well, the sensations have gone. The experiences have now gone. And in that sense, the room has vanished. But something, says Mill, has nevertheless remained. Well, what? Well, says Mill, the possibility of having future sensations when we return has remained. See, if we all came back into the room and looked around, we would have sensations again. In other words, even though our sensations are fleeting and temporary, there is something which is permanent, namely the possibility of having sensations when we come back. The actual sensations depend on us. In their case, their being consists of their being perceived. But what exists independently of us and permanently is the possibility of having sensations. That alone is external to us, objective. And therefore, if we mean by matter something which exists permanently and apart from us, we reach the following definition of matter, which is Mill's definition. Matter is, quote, the permanent possibility of sensation, unquote. Now you have to try and get this point. He's not saying that it's possible for us to have experiences because there are real material objects out there independent of us. Matter is, by definition, the possibility of our having sensations. So out there, apart from us, there are just simply free-floating possibilities. There's nothing actual. Now, if you ask me, how can a possibility exist apart from anything actual out there, that would be a good question to which there is no answer. And you see here the primacy of consciousness. In Mill, reality is defined in terms of actual or possible sensations. Another point, what is Mill's view on God? Well, in very characteristic fashion, he is essentially non-committal. He's an agnostic on the question of God. He thinks the evidence is not conclusive one way or the other. You know the standard line, you can't prove there is a God, and he can't prove there isn't one, and therefore we can't be sure. He does say that the existence of human suffering, of evil in the world, proves that there couldn't be an all-powerful and all-good being. He does argue that if there is a God, and if he's a moral being, he must then not be all-powerful. Otherwise, why doesn't he prevent, for instance, people in small Italian villages from being bathed in molten lava periodically, etc.? On the other hand, if God is all-powerful, he says he can't be benevolent, because why would he let these things happen? But in any event, whether there is such a being or not, we can't know. You get a taste, I think. I'll give you one final taste of the caliber of Mill's philosophy. What is his viewpoint on the laws of logic, the laws of mathematics? Are they necessary truths? Can you rely on them as absolutes? Well, of course, says Mill, no. Because all our knowledge is based on experience. And from experience, as Hume established and as Mill agrees, we can never get necessity. What's the status then of the laws of mathematics and logic? They are generalizations from experience with a high degree of probability. Why does it seem to you that they are more than simply highly probable generalizations? Well, because of the operation of the associative mechanism. For instance, the number of times you counted 2 and 2 and got 4 is so staggering that after a while you have a built-in association. When someone says 2 and 2, you have this compulsive feeling that it's going to have to be 4. And that explains your sense that 2 and 2 must be 4. But as a matter of fact, we can never be in a position to say anything in reality is absolutely necessary. Exceptions are always possible, and most we can say is it's very probable. For all we know, it might be the case that in some far-off corner of the universe that we haven't explored, 2 and 2 is 9 1/4. Bachelors are married. Triangles have 9 sides. A is non-A. All we haven't just happened to not have encountered such experiences so far. And Mill, I may say, thinks it's unlikely that there are such phenomena, but you can't be certain. Needless to say, this is a setup for Hegel, Marx, the romanticists, and the irrationalists who proceed to say, we found the exceptions, you see. Well, let's leave that as a ringing defense of reason and reality. I give you a kind of taste of the utterly second-rate character of the metaphysics and epistemology of the utilitarians, and turn instead to their ethics. You see why we talk about these as minor philosophers. Let's look now at the ethics of Bentham and Mill. Well, since they are empiricists, we have the problem of deriving values from facts. How are we going to establish? They want an objective code of ethics. How are we going to establish it? Since, as we know from Hume, we cannot observe the values. We cannot observe the art. Well, taking their lead from many early philosophers, the empiricists, the utilitarians, Bentham and Mill, decide to appeal to human desires. All we can actually observe is what people actually want, what they actually desire. And therefore, the basis of ethics is going to have to be an appeal to the actual nature of human desires. Now, you will immediately say, well, won't that lead to subjectivism? One man desires one thing, and then if that's the standard for him, he'll have one code of values, and somebody else desires something else, and if that's the standard, he'll have another, and won't this just lead to complete subjectivism? And the answer of Bentham and Mill and people of this type is no. We can avoid subjectivism by finding one desire which all human beings have, one universally held fundamental basic desire which all human beings have. And if we can find this one desire that's at the root of all human motivation, and then found our ethics on that one desire, it will be, they say, an objective basis for ethics. There will be no subjective variations from person to person. All will agree on the ultimate value because all will want this as the ultimate. And here you see an example of the collectively subjective becoming the objective. Well, let's proceed. Our assignment is to find some one thing which all human beings by their nature necessarily want as their ultimate goal. And that then is going to become the standard of value. What is the one thing? What is the X which everyone wants? The basic motivating desire. Is it money? Well, obviously, no, there are people who don't want money. Is it fame? No, there are recluses, there are people who don't care about being famous. Is it life? No, there are suicides. Well, what is it? Well, the utilitarians looked around. They didn't originate the theory I'm about to present. It was a famous theory in ancient Greece. So they picked it up from there. But they looked around, in effect, and reasoned like this. However, men differ in their specific aims, specific things they're after. The one thing they really are after ultimately is enjoyment, happiness, in a word, pleasure. A man wants money not as an end in itself, but because he gets pleasure out of it. And if a man doesn't want money, it's because he doesn't get any pleasure out of it. If he got pleasure out of it, he'd want it, and so on. Therefore, we can conclude that the one fundamental desire of all human beings is to get as much pleasure as they can and or as little pain as possible. We put in the part about pain because sometimes human beings are confronted with a situation where they have only a choice of pain, like going to the dentist and suffering now or not going and suffering worse next month. So from the decay that's finished. So we put in that qualification. But we reach this conclusion. Every human being has one fundamental desire: to achieve as much pleasure and or as little pain as he can for himself. And that theory has been christened, it's been given the name psychological hedonism. Psychological hedonism, and I'll give you a definition of psychological hedonism. Every human being, is the doctrine which holds it, every human being, in every one of his actions, is motivated, is that too fast? By the desire to achieve one, only one goal, as much pleasure and or as little pain as possible for himself. To repeat, psychological hedonism is the doctrine that every human being in every one of his actions is motivated by the desire to achieve as much pleasure and or as little pain as he can for himself. It's called psychological hedonism. Hedonism, from the Greek word hedone, meaning pleasure, and psychological hedonism because, as I've dictated it to you, this is not yet an ethical theory. This claims to be simply a straightforward, factual description of human nature. A psychological theory telling us the wellspring of human motivation, the way people actually behave. And it's going to be contrasted shortly with a doctrine called ethical hedonism, which is going to be built on it, and which will be an ethical doctrine. But at this stage, it simply claims to be a description of the way people behave, and it's called psychological hedonism. As I mentioned, it is a venerable theory, which goes way back to the ancient world. Epicurus, among others, was one of its famous advocates in the ancient world. Now, before we proceed to the ethics which the utilitarians erected on this basis, I'd like to say a few words by way of criticism of this doctrine. It's a very commonly held doctrine. If you teach beginners in philosophy and you present this doctrine, you can usually find something like 90% of the class who will subscribe to it as though it is an obvious truth. There's a great many people believe that it's so. And therefore I want to indicate to you briefly some of the types of objections to which this doctrine is susceptible. To begin with, it is clearly a deterministic doctrine. It holds that all men are run by nature by this inbuilt pleasure-pain mechanism. They of necessity must pursue as much pleasure as they can and or as little pain as they can for themselves. Bentham says, quote, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure," unquote. And he goes on to say it's for them alone to determine what we actually shall do. In other words, the desire for pleasure built into us rules and controls all of our behavior, which implies that we have got no choice about how we behave. We have no free will. Our fundamental motivation is determined, and that, of course, determines all the subsidiary actions we take to fulfill it. Well, if that's the case, then of course ethics becomes dispensable right off the bat. If you're to have an ethics, if there's to be any point in telling people how they should live, then you have to believe that human beings have free choice. In other words, if you're to have an ethics, your basic motivating goals must be freely chosen. Otherwise, man is simply a puppet, and ethics is a waste of time. You see, the problem that the empiricists have here, if they find a universal inbuilt desire, then ethics is dispensable. There's no use trying to construct one on its basis. If they don't, and they find simply varying desires, then ethics has no objective basis, and they have to call themselves subjectivist and explicitly say it's all arbitrary, which in this case they didn't want to do. That's one type of problem with the doctrine of psychological hedonism. But there is another major objection to this doctrine. It's put forth by empiricists who claim to arrive at it by observation of human behavior. Well, what about the glaring exceptions that there are to this doctrine? Now you consider what this doctrine tells you. Every human being, in every action, is motivated by the desire to get as much pleasure as he possibly can for himself. What do you do with a medieval ascetic, who is, after all, a human being? Now you take someone like Francis of Assisi, for instance. He held that pleasure was an evil, that you should not attempt to get any pleasure during this life on earth, that was a commandment of God. And he was extraordinarily ingenious in applying this belief. He went out of his way to avoid experiencing pleasure. So, for instance, he found that if he even ate the minimum necessary to sustain himself physically, there was a certain pleasure in the process of passing from hunger to fullness. And therefore, he thought of the idea of sprinkling sand on his food to destroy its taste. For the same reason, to satisfy his thirst, he drank laundry water. He slept on a rock as his pillow so that he wouldn't get any enjoyment and relaxation. Needless to say, not to go into his sex life, but when, which was nil, but when he felt an access of sexual desire, it was his custom to strip himself naked and plunge into a snow heap in order to see to rout the temperature. Now, if you look at it, on the face of it, it certainly seems bizarre to say this man is motivated in every one of his actions by the desire to achieve as much pleasure as he possibly can. Or what do you do about the cases which do exist of altruistic self-sacrificing? A boy wants to go into a certain career and he's convinced that it's what will make him happy, and his parents tell him that they'll be miserable if he goes into this career, he should go into another one. And he says, and there are cases such as this, that he knows he's giving up his chance of happiness, but he feels that he has a duty and obligation to sacrifice for his parents because of all they've done for him or because of the ethics he subscribes to and so on. And therefore, he does knowingly sacrifice for others. Now, we're not here commenting on whether it's good or bad, but simply such phenomena take place. How do you say in the case of such a person that his action is motivated by the desire to get as much pleasure as he can? Or again, what do you do with impulsive, unthinking, neurotic type of behavior, which is blatantly make you miserable rather than happy? I've heard of a type of party that used to be given in Greenwich Village, for instance, in which on a dare, an individual would be asked at a certain point of intoxication to go out on the street and propose marriage to the first woman that came by. So I've been told this actually took place. And the individual woke up, went across the straight line, and got married, and woke up the next morning with a 67 or 70-year-old woman and his teenage kid that he had married on a bet. Now, when you say his action is motivated by the desire to get as much pleasure as he possibly could for himself, he thought that this was the way to achieve the greatest happiness, it's just that he made a big mistake. I mean, that would be a fantastic thing to say. You'd think the reasonable thing to say would be, he didn't think at all about what he was doing. He acted completely impulsively, and the thought of whether this action was going to give him his greatest possible pleasure never entered his mind. Now, in the face of all these type of exceptions, you would think that a psychological hedonist who is supposed to base his doctrine on experience would abandon the doctrine and would say it's certainly not true that every human being pursues pleasure for himself. But the fact is that the typical psychological hedonist is entirely unfazed by these type of examples. If you give him these type of examples, he doesn't bat an eye. He simply says to you, you haven't analyzed these examples correctly. If you analyze these examples correctly, he says, you would see that all of them are really still seeking their own selfish pleasure. It just happens to be that they have got a very different idea of how to get their particular pleasure. But their motive is still their own personal enjoyment. Typically, they say, for instance, to take just Francis of Assisi, just that case, they say, if you analyze it deeply enough, you would see that he gets his pleasure out of obeying God. And some of them even add, secretly he is lusting after the pleasure of heaven, and he's making just a long-range calculation. If I give up temporary pleasures now, I'll have an orgy of bliss when the other world comes. And of course you can do that with all of these people, the same type of position. The pattern of the argument is then like this. They begin by saying, all men seek personal pleasure, put it that way for short. You then give them glaring exceptions. They come back and say, you haven't analyzed these exceptions deeply enough. If you did, you'd see that they really are seeking nothing but pleasure. Well, now there's an obvious question to ask at this point. Namely, how do you know? How do you know that if you analyze these people deeply enough, you will see that they really are seeking pleasure despite all appearances to the contrary? What evidence do you have that down deep in his soul, Francis of Assisi and this self-sacrificing boy and this impulsive youth and so on that I mentioned are all really seeking pleasure, and that if we only put them under a psychological fluoroscope, we would find that desire for pleasure at the base of their behavior? Now, confronted with this question, the psychological hedonist comes back with this answer. Well, but they must be seeking pleasure, because after all men seek pleasure. That's the basic human motivation. Now, this is obviously a grotesque case of the fallacy of begging the question. That is to say, of using the very thing you're trying to prove in the process of proving it. And if you will permit this methodology, I can establish the most wondrous things about human motivation by exactly the same method. For instance, I will make up a theory which I call psychological pineappleism. And psychological pineappleism is the theory that every human being and every one of his actions is motivated by one and only one desire, namely to get as many pineapples as he can for himself. Now, I can point to a certain amount of evidence. After all, there's all the Hawaiian pineapple companies, all the people that drink pineapple juice, etc. And then you say to me, well, but what about the obvious exceptions to this doctrine? What about the people who are just indifferent to pineapples? They just don't care one way or the other. What about the people who passionately hate pineapples? And I come back and I say, well, look, you haven't analyzed those cases deeply enough. The man who's indifferent had a painful experience when he was young. He was frustrated in his search for pineapples, and consequently, to protect himself, he just repressed his desire. As for the one who hates pineapples, well, he's obviously engaging in reaction formation. Consequently, all you have to do is analyze these cases on a profound enough level. Now, there's nothing to choose between that obviously nonsensical example and the case of the psychological hedonism. Because if you ask me, well, how do you know that this is what you would find if you investigated them all deeply enough, my answer would be, well, it must be, because that's the way human beings are. They all are after pineapples. And that's just what the psychological hedonist maneuver is. If you want to take a psychological hedonist aback, simply point this out to him, that you could do the same thing with any fantastic theory of human motivation. In other words, by that circular method of reasoning, you can prove anything, which means that you really can't prove anything. If you go by the actual facts, and if you observe the state of the world's philosophy, the condemnation of pleasure on the part of a great many philosophers, if you observe the misery of a great many people, if you look at the course of history, I suggest to you that it is inexplicable if pleasure-seeking is the basic goal inherent in human nature. Pleasure cannot be that hard to get. If everybody at his core wants nothing but to get as much pleasure as he can, every part of his action is devoted to achieving that goal, how could you possibly account for the degree of misery that there is? In other words, I conclude psychological hedonism is false. However, let's go back now and see what the utilitarians do with it. From psychological hedonism, they derive an ethical theory. Ethical theory they derive is called ethical hedonism. And it is the doctrine that pleasure and pleasure alone is good in itself, and pain alone is evil or bad in itself, and everything else is to be judged by reference to its pleasure-pain consequences. Should I dictate that more slowly? Ethical hedonism is the doctrine that pleasure and pleasure alone is good in itself, and pain alone is evil in itself, or bad in itself. and everything else is to be evaluated by reference to its pleasure-pain consequences. Now, this doctrine is called ethical hedonism, you see, because it is now an ethical doctrine. It's no longer simply a description of human nature, but a statement of how we should value. We should make pleasure the standard of our values and judge everything accordingly. And that's why it gets its name. Again, I may say this is in no sense an original modern doctrine. It goes all the way back to the early followers of Socrates, Aristippus for one, and again Epicurus for another, were ethical hedonists. And their argument for it was a simple derivation from psychological hedonism. They said, since man is built in such a way that he can only pursue pleasure, there's no use telling him to accept anything else as his ultimate value. If man is a pleasure-seeking mechanism by nature, then when we get to ethics, it's pointless to recommend that he hold anything other than pleasure as his ultimate value, because that's all he can do. As one commentator supporting the hedonist position put it, if you had proved that all human beings could care about was lemon pies, then when you came to ethics, that was your psychological theory. See, then when you came to ethics, you'd have to say lemon pies are the standard of the good. There'd be no use telling them to pursue banana pies or anything else, because all they could care about was lemon pies. Now, there's a common objection raised on this transition from psychological hedonism to ethical hedonism. We seem to have conjured up a miracle, because we started from a statement, psychological hedonism, of what men actually desire, and we ended up with a statement of what people ought to do, what they ought to value. And the question is, how were we able to do that? How could we start off saying, this is what people desire, and end up saying, this is what is desirable? This is how people ought to behave. Well, Mill was aware that there was a jump here, there was a leap from the fact that people desire something to the conclusion that they ought to. And to answer this, he put forth a famous argument, which I'll give you briefly. It's commonly quoted in logic texts as an arch example of a certain fallacy, but I'll mention it for what it's worth. His argument goes like this. The only proof that we can give that something is audible is that people actually hear it. The only proof that we can give that something is visible is that people actually see it. Similarly, he says, the only proof we can give that something is desirable is that people actually desire it. And now, since pleasure is what people actually desire, it follows that pleasure is what is desirable. You get that argument? You can't prove something is visible unless people actually see it. You prove it's audible by showing that people actually hear it. Therefore, you prove it's desirable by showing that people actually desire it. What is the fallacy of this argument? Well, technically it's an equivocation, meaning the use of part of speech in two different senses. And in this case, it's the ibble-abble, which is being equivocated on, the suffix. When you say audible, you mean capable of being heard. When you say visible, you mean capable of being seen. When you say desirable, you don't mean capable of being desired. You mean ought to be desired. It's right to be desired. It's good to be desired. In other words, when you say something is desirable, that's a synonym for saying it's good, it's worthwhile, it's of value. It doesn't simply mean, as a matter of fact, people are capable of desiring it. And therefore, Mill was simply, in this famous argument, equivocating on ibble-abble. See? In other words, there really is no way to get from a statement that people desire something to the conclusion that therefore that is objectively a value. If you're going to establish objective values, you cannot do so simply by a survey of human desires. In any case, let's proceed. We've now established, at least to the utilitarian satisfaction, the truth of ethical hedonism. Now be sure you understand the meaning of this doctrine. It's the doctrine that pleasure is the standard of value, the ultimate criterion, the guiding standard. If you have any question about what's good, bad, right, wrong, worth doing, not worth doing, you answer it by reference to its pleasure consequence. Notice, if you hold that pleasure or happiness is good, that's not yet ethical hedonism. If you hold that it's the purpose of life, but that you have a distinct standard, as objectivism holds, for instance, namely life is the standard and happiness is the purpose, that's not hedonism. Hedonism is the premise that pleasure as such is the standard, the gauge, by reference to which all other values are to be determined. Well, if we understand that much, the question, of course, that we have to ask is, well, whose pleasures are to be the standard? Now, Epicurus in the ancient world had said, well, since we're basing the whole thing on psychological hedonism, and psychological hedonism tells us that everyone is inherently selfish, then there's no use telling people to be anything but selfish, because that's the way human beings are. And consequently, Epicurus is called an egoistic ethical hedonist. In other words, he holds that man should pursue only his own pleasure, that each individual should try to get as much pleasure as he can for himself. The utilitarians, however, at this point diverge from Epicurus. Remember, we are now in the Christian era. We're now out of pagan ancient Greece, and it's commonly conceded that it is not moral to seek your own selfish pleasure. Whose pleasure then should you seek, according to this viewpoint? Not just your own, but everyone's. You should seek, in the phrase that Bentham made famous, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. In effect, their argument is like this: if pleasure is the good, then what a man's moral obligation is to produce as much of it as he possibly can, to pile up as much of that good as he possibly can. It's a strictly quantitative ethics. Pleasure is the good, and our goal is simply to heap it up, to produce the greatest possible quantity of pleasure that we possibly can in mankind as a whole. Notice, therefore, the nature of the recipients of our action is entirely irrelevant. It doesn't make any difference from the point of view of this ethics whether you're making heroes or killers happy, whether they have any claim on happiness from you or not. Every man counts as one unit and equal to every other. You contemplate the courses of action confronting you, and whichever leads to the greatest pleasure is the right act. I was saying that we have a strictly quantitative criterion of ethical behavior. If one action produces, for instance, I just pull figures out of the hat, 250 units of pleasure, and another action produces 200, taking into account all the people involved, then the one that produces 250 is the right action, if those are the only two choices. We simply want to produce as much as we possibly can. This point of view, in contrast to Epicurus' egoistic ethical hedonism, is called universalistic ethical hedonism, because you consider all men universally and not simply you, the actor. And it is for this view that, for a shorthand, Bentham coined the term utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a synonym for universalistic ethical hedonism. And of course, the word utilitarianism itself comes from the word utility, and his concept of utility is a thing has utility or is useful if it is productive of the greatest happiness of the greatest number. If you want to see the historical derivation of this theory in a nutshell, you could put it like this. Epicurus said, love pleasure. Christianity said, love your neighbor. Utilitarians say, love your neighbor's pleasure. Now, they sometimes are eager to say that this is not an altruistic theory. They say because you are, after all, allowed to count yourself as one human being. And therefore, sometimes there are certain commentators who make a big point of saying we must distinguish this, which is universalistic and allows you to take into account all men, including yourself, from a strict altruism which says you can't consider yourself. Now, practically speaking, this distinction is utterly insignificant. There is no action I can imagine that I've ever heard anybody point out that would come out differently if you allowed yourself to count as one unit out of the 3 billion involved rather than a zero out of the 3 billion involved. So for practical purposes, it's a meaningless distinction. It is clearly a Christianized hedonism, and you can hear the Christianity in the utilitarians out of their own mouths. Here is a typical quote from Mill from his famous work on utilitarianism. Quote, "I must again repeat what the assailants of utilitarianism seldom have the justice to acknowledge, namely that the happiness which forms the utilitarian standard of what is right in conduct is not the agent's own happiness, but that of all concerned. As between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires him to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. In the golden rule of Jesus of Nazareth, we read the complete spirit of the ethics of utility. To do as you would be done by and to love your neighbor as yourself constitute the ideal perfection of utilitarian morality." Unquote. Now there's a clear statement of the Christian altruist element in the utilitarian ethics. Now you may wonder whether Mill thinks that he has, in his work on utilitarianism, given an objective proof of this ethics. And the answer is he himself says that he has not. Remember, this is an empiricist approach to ethics, and for all they attempt to make it objective, at a certain point they recognize that they are basing ethics strictly on an appeal to man's feelings, and Mill claims this quite openly at times. Here's a passage, for instance. Quote, "The ultimate sanction, therefore, of all morality being a subjective feeling in our own minds, I see nothing embarrassing to those whose standard is utility in the question, what is the sanction of that particular standard? We may answer, the same as of all other moral standards, the conscientious feelings of mankind. Undoubtedly, this sanction has no binding efficacy on those who do not possess the feelings it appeals to." Unquote. Now there's a clear statement from the boss's mouth himself that this ethics rests upon having a certain feeling. If you have a Christian hedonist feeling, okay. If not, they claim there's no further proof that they can give. In any event, we reach then the utilitarian ethics. Here is Bentham's statement of it, if you want. A simple one-sentence statement of the so-called principle of utility, the principle governing all ethical behavior. Quote, "The greatest happiness of all those whose interest is in question is the only right and proper end of human action in every situation." I'll give you that one because that's famous. "The greatest happiness of all those whose interest is in question is the only right and proper end of human action in every situation." Unquote. That's the principle of utility. Now, the first question we want to ask about this type of theory is, it's supposed to be an ethical theory. It's supposed to give us the standard by reference to which to decide what things to value, what actions to take. Well, does it fulfill at least its function as an ethical standard? Does it give us concrete advice as to what to do, how to live? Does it enable us to form a code of values, even mistaken ones? Now, that's not the question. Does it enable us to form a code of values of any sort to enable us to know what to do? And I here speak now for myself, not for Mill or Bentham, and offer criticism. I would maintain that it does not. That hedonism of any type is a contentless ethics. Take it first on the egoistic or individual level for a moment. Imagine someone who takes hedonism seriously from scratch. He has no other code of values. He decides he's going to follow strictly along the hedonist method. The hedonist tells him, prior to valuing anything, determine whether or not it leads you to pleasure. If it leads you to pleasure, then okay, value it. Now, let's follow along such a completely consistent hedonist who doesn't borrow a code of values from any other theory, but is going to simply follow hedonism. He says pleasure is his only value, his only end, and he's going to value other things only if he finds they give him pleasure. He's a consistent hedonist, remember. And therefore, he's never valued anything except things which he finds give him pleasure. His position is simply, before he values a thing, he's going to find out whether it gives him pleasure. Now I give him $1 million, for instance. Well, will that produce any pleasure in him? Well, obviously not. Wealth will produce pleasure in a person only if he values it. Doesn't have any value judgment declaring wealth as worthwhile, you can shower him with $1 million and he'll be indifferent to it. If you don't place a value upon wealth, you cannot experience pleasure from obtaining wealth. But the hedonist, by definition, won't value wealth until he gets pleasure from it. So he's in this position. He has to value wealth before it gives him pleasure. But by his theory, it has to give him pleasure before he'll value it. And the same is true for the whole gamut of values. Whether you talk of fame or love or knowledge, it doesn't make any difference. All of these things produce pleasure in their possessors only if they're valued by their possessors. If a man refuses to pass judgments of value until he gets pleasure from something, he never will get pleasure from the thing, because the pleasure would be possible only if he antecedently valued the object. And the problem that any hedonist in is therefore that he has a complete reversal of the right order of things. The proper order, the necessary order, is first you value something, and then when you achieve it, it gives you pleasure. Pleasure, as an emotion, is a response to your value judgments, and it therefore presupposes a code of values. If you truly try to live exclusively by hedonism and wait to value things with pleasure, you could never end up with anything that you value. In this sense, hedonism is a contentless ethics. You could not live by it strictly. It gives you no concrete advice. And that would be true of any ethics which took an emotion as the standard of value. Another way of putting the point is to say that hedonism is a parasitic ethics, meaning that it presupposes to be acted on that an individual bring an already formed set of values formed by reference to some other ethical theory before he can apply the hedonist advice. And that means that what a hedonist is in practice is somebody who says, take whatever it is you happen to value, no matter how you came to value it or why, no matter whether it's rational or not, and simply go ahead and try to achieve it. That's what it really comes down to in practice. And that is why we say that hedonists are really whim worshippers. They simply want something, and they then proceed to pursue it. Now, we've been talking about this on the level of individuals so far, and saying that hedonism gives no objective guidance, generates no code of values. Now imagine this same problem, but on the level of mankind as a whole. Imagine an ethics like this, where you are instructed to satisfy not just your own personal whims, but the greatest whims of the greatest number of people, namely utilitarians. A situation you have in which everybody's arbitrary desires must be considered, everybody's random values and pleasures, whether authentic or neurotic, rational or irrational, valid or insane, whatever anybody happens to value, and you're confronted with this mass of humanity filled, stuffed full with all of their varying, conflicting value judgments, and the injunction you're given is go out and make the most of them have as much pleasure as you can. Satisfy as many whims as possible. Now you see, it would be impossible to decide what to do in such a circumstance. And thus it's no surprise that if you put any concrete question to a utilitarian, to two utilitarians, they almost inevitably will disagree as to which is the action that will lead to the greatest happiness of the greatest number. The hardest thing in the world is to get two utilitarians to both say the same thing as to what action to take. Which, of course, is a grave flaw in an ethical theory, because if an ethical theory is supposed to be anything, it's supposed to tell you how to live. Now, you may then be surprised in the light of the criticism I've raised if I tell you that Bentham claimed to have worked out a clear-cut mathematical method of deciding which action leads to the greatest happiness of the greatest number. This method he called the hedonic calculus. And no presentation of utilitarianism would be complete without reference to it. So you can title your notes now the hedonic calculus. Hedonic calculus is a method of telling you how to decide in any given case what action leads to the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And what you do is simply this. You take some action that you're contemplating taking. You make a list of all the people affected by that action, either positively or negatively. You then compute mathematically, by a method I'll tell you in a moment, the amount of pleasure that that action will produce and the amount of pain it will produce. And you make yourself a profit and loss column, like a business transaction. You head one side pleasure and the other side pain. You stick in the figure for the amount of pleasure and the amount of pain that that action will produce. You do that for all the various actions that you're considering at the time, and then you simply subtract the pain from the pleasure for each one, and you get a figure. Whichever one gives you the greatest net balance of pleasure over pain is then the action which leads to the greatest happiness, the greatest number, and that's the one that you should do. Well, of course, your question will be, how do you go about mathematicizing pleasures? How do you go about putting in quantitative terms pleasures? Bentham held that this in principle could be done. He said the only difference between pleasures is quantitative. They don't differ in quality. They differ simply in degree or amount, not in kind. And therefore, for Bentham, the pleasure of having dinner, listening to Beethoven, engaging in sex, studying mathematics, whipping your brother-in-law, doesn't make any difference. All of those are the same in kind and differ only in amount. His famous line in this connection was, quantity of pleasure being equal, pushpin is as good as poetry. Pushpin is like bowling, you see. And he's indicating that all that counts is the amount of pleasure. Now we have to quantify pleasure. How will we do it? Well, Bentham listed 6 factors which he thought were in principle quantifiable. And if we list these 6 factors, you get an idea of how to quantify pleasures. Well, one factor is obviously the intensity of the pleasure. Some pleasures are very intense, some are very mild. Contrast pleasure of sex, for instance, from the pleasure of discovering a new toothpaste. Now we can theoretically range pleasures along a continuum according to the degree of their intensity and work out units. You see, one pleasure is approximately twice as strong, as intense as another, and so on. That's one factor. But then again, we have another factor, namely duration. How long does the pleasure last? For instance, suppose we had a 5-unit intensity pleasure, which lasted for 3 hours. That would give us 15 unit hours of pleasure, as against a 10-unit intensity, which lasted for 1 hour, which would give us only 10 units, you see. So there, clearly we want to take the weaker pleasure for longer, you see. We multiply the two. And the third factor he mentioned is probability or certainty. How sure are you that this action is going to lead to pleasure? Suppose there's 1 chance out of 2 that it will lead to pleasure. Then we have to multiply by a fraction to reduce our result because we're not sure it's going to take place. Then there's a fourth factor, what he called fecundity. Some pleasures are fecund, that is to say they are productive of future pleasures. And of course we want to get in all the pleasures in our calculus, including all the ones that come in the future. So for instance, playing pool would be given as an example typically of a dead-end pleasure. It's not fecund, you see. But studying metaphysics opens the door for ecstasy in the future. And therefore, what we have to do is take into account the fecundity, and for each of the future pleasures, try to estimate its intensity, its duration, its probability or certainty, and add that factor in. Then there's the factor of propinquity, is number 5. How near in time is the pleasure? Because other things being equal, said Bentham, we'd rather have the pleasure tomorrow than 10 years from now. So we add in a factor to reduce the amount if it's too far in the future. And then finally there's the purity of pleasures. Purity means is it mixed with or followed by pain? And of course if it is, then you have to estimate the intensity, duration, and probability and so on of the pain and put that in the negative column. So the method of figuring out the greatest happiness or the greatest number is really very simple. You simply list the possible actions that confront you. For each action, you list the various people that are affected by it. You're allowed to count yourself as one unit, one person. Then you simply calculate the intensity, duration, probability, propinquity, fecundity, and purity. I think I got them all. For each of the persons involved, you add it all up, compute, and the right action follows mathematically. Now you probably want an example of how this works. Well, the first question we have is what actions are we supposed to list as the alternative possibilities? Somebody says, for instance, he wants to rob a bank. Does that count? Is that allowed as a candidate? Well, yes, because we have to remember that according to this ethics, and they're very explicit about this, there are no moral absolutes but one, namely the greatest happiness and the greatest number. You cannot say that robbing banks is always wrong. You can't say that murdering innocent victims is always wrong. You can't say that lying, breaking promises, etc. The end justifies the means. We can do whatever we want to an individual or a group so long as we can prove that it leads to the greatest happiness and the greatest number. Well, then what should we list as our possible actions? We have no principles that are absolute in advance to tell us certain types of action are out. We have to judge each situation by reference to the greatest happiness and the greatest number. Well, should we rob a bank? Will that do it? Should we join the Peace Corps? Maybe we should get a job. If so, which job? Should you become a doctor, a lawyer, or what will produce the greatest happiness or the greatest number? Well, theoretically, if you're in real doubt, you're supposed to take each one of these actions and run it through the hedonic calculus. But let's suppose that out of kindness we limit it to 2 or 3 possibilities. Let's suppose we decide now we're going to study the possibility of robbing a bank and see whether that will lead to the greatest happiness, the greatest number or not. Well, the next advice is we list all the people that are affected by this action. We want to get all the pleasure and pain that this action will produce. Well, who are the people affected? Obviously, the robber is one. He has, let us say, 5 children. They're affected. We've got to put them in. The bank tellers are affected. Presumably they will experience pain, although maybe one of them will be very brave and get a citation afterwards, in which case that's a jot of pleasure. We have to take that as a possibility into account. The depositors of the bank, if they hear about this raid, will probably feel a lot of pain. On the other hand, there may be policemen who think to themselves, well, if people didn't rob banks, we'd never be called into action, and therefore this is give them a real jolt of pleasure. We want to be sure and get that in. And of course, there may be a lady on the street right at the time of the bank holdup who saw it and is very excited and feels a terrific amount of pleasure that this big event happened. And then she rushes home and tells one of her neighbors, and the neighbor is very envious that she wasn't there and feels pain. We've got to take that into account. And then, of course, the neighbor may be very mean to her son because of her envy. And that, you get the idea. The insurance company is going to feel painful. But on the other hand, the communists may be very happy that the capitalist institution is there. Now, you tell me where you draw the line, and once we get all of these people, we then, of course, for each one, have to calculate the intensity, duration, probability, propinquity, fecundity, and purity. Now, I suggest to you that this is hopeless and entirely impossible as a guide to action. And that is one of the reasons why today there are a great many utilitarians. One of their commonest rallying cries is that they're for the public good, which is a typical utilitarian phrase, the public being the greatest number and good being enjoyment or pleasure, but they have radically different views as to what constitutes the welfare of the public and the good of the public. What actions will lead to it, because this theory generates absolutely no advice at all. Now, there are a number of criticisms of the utilitarian ethics in the available objectivist literature, textbook of Americanism by Ayn Rand, in the objectivist ethics, so I want to be very brief in my concluding remarks on utilitarianism. I'm not going to say anything about the altruism inherent in this doctrine, because I think it should be obvious to the members of this audience what is wrong with that. What I do want to do is indicate to you briefly why it's hopeless to try, as Benjamin Mill did, to defend capitalism on the basis of utilitarianism. Benjamin Mill claimed that laissez-faire capitalism led to the greatest happiness of the greatest number, and therefore on that ground they were for it. But the fact is that their ethical theory is fundamentally, philosophically inimical to their politics. And that's proved, incidentally, by the fact that Mill himself ended his life as a socialist. The Fabian socialists in Britain were his immediate disciples. Now why? Why is capitalism ethically incompatible with utilitarianism? Well, consider just simply three brief points. Capitalism depends ethically on egoism. It's a system, above all, which tells a person to pursue his selfish personal profit. Secondly, capitalism depends upon the principle of individual, absolute, inalienable rights. The whole essence of the capitalist system is to say the government cannot, on principle, interfere with the rights of the individual. That's what protects the individual from being devoured by the government. And finally, capitalism is a system in which justice rules, in which you are required to earn the satisfaction of your needs, and you cannot expect or demand something from someone that you don't pay for, that you haven't earned, that you don't deserve. Now consider utilitarianism on each of these points. Well, on the first point of egoism is obvious. Self-sacrifice for the greatest number is the essence of this theory. You count as merely one unit, so it's a thoroughly altruist theory. What about on point two? Absolute inalienable rights. Well, this is explicitly denied by the utilitarians. Remember, there are no absolutes on this theory except the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Whatever leads to the greatest happiness of the greatest number is right. That is the principle of ethics. Therefore, if you want to kill an innocent man, expropriate, enslave, if you can show that it leads to the greatest happiness of the greatest number on this ethics, that is the moral and proper thing to do. Now, I should say that Bentham and Mill do not recommend these actions as a general policy. But they don't think they lead to the greatest happiness of the greatest number. But their theory avowedly declares the utilitarian consequences of an action alone count. In other words, we have a morality of expediency par excellence. A man on this view does not own his property, his freedom, or his life by absolute inalienable right. He has a claim to them only so long as that's regarded as conducive to the greatest number's happiness. And that, of course, depends on how any particular person decides to determine that, which is just seen as non-determinable by this theory. But according to this view, you see, man is owned by society, by the collective, by the greatest number. And he's to be left free only insofar as this serves their welfare. Well, that, of course, is the basic premise of collectivism, the antithesis of any individualist or capitalist system. Which brings us finally to the question of justice. What is it that entitles the greatest number to such consideration? What has the greatest number done to earn every man's service? And the answer of utilitarians is simply nothing, except they are the greatest number. It's strictly a quantitative issue, as I mentioned earlier. According to this ethics, a man can form and assert any desire he wishes, for a salary, for love, for jobs, you name it. It is not morally incumbent upon him to earn the object of his desire. He merely has to be able to show on this ethics that if the state expropriates what he desires from those who have produced it, that will lead to the undefinable greatest happiness of the greatest number. You just run it through the hedonic calculus. You see, the approach here is two men are as such more important, more deserving of consideration than one, and on up, regardless of the nature of the men, their character, what they actually justly, validly have coming to them. The principle is you sacrifice the hedonic minority to the hedonic majority, regardless of the objective merits or vices of the majority. Well, so much for their view of justice. Now, it shouldn't surprise you then that laissez-faire capitalism is doomed on this kind of basis, and that today it is the statists who appeal to the utilitarian ethics. If utilitarianism is the base of capitalism, capitalism has no chance. So much for the utilitarianism. Now let's turn for a few brief words to Herbert Spencer, who is 1820 to 1903. He was considered a major philosopher in the 19th century, but he's completely dead in terms of his influence today. As I mentioned, he doesn't even appear in most histories anymore, except for perhaps a brief paragraph. He had a complex system of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. None of it worth our time tonight. It's no longer advocated by anyone. If you want just a taste of his metaphysics, he agrees completely with Kant that reality in itself is unknowable, and for very Kantian reasons. Reality is a mystery beyond man's power to grasp. We have an instinctive feeling that behind the phenomena we observe, says Spencer, there must be a reality producing our experiences, but it's unknowable. However, he goes on, even though we can't know reality and have to limit ourselves to describing the phenomenal world, there is, he thought, a basic law of the phenomenal world, namely the law of evolution. of evolution. He was, of course, profoundly influenced by Darwin here, and he proceeded to apply the principle of evolution to every aspect of the universe, to physics, psychology, epistemology, you name it. He formulated a very complex, highly technical theory of universal evolution. But none of that needs to concern us tonight. I want to restrict myself in these last few minutes simply to evolution as it applies to living organisms. Now, in its barest essentials, the theory of evolution was an attempt to explain the development of higher organisms out of lower, less complex and developed ones as follows. This is what the general theory of evolution held. In each generation of offspring of some organism, there are slight variations. Some are more able to deal with nature, some are less able. Some are more able to adapt to their environment, some less. Some, in effect, are better equipped for living, some less. And in each generation, there is a limit on the amount of food available. There's not enough in nature for all the offspring in a given generation to survive. Consequently, it was held there is a struggle for existence among living creatures. And in this struggle, the ones best adapted to the environment win out, at the expense of the weaker members. The weaker ones are simply weeded out and eliminated. And this is the so-called process of natural selection. Nature itself makes a selection. It allows the best to survive and eliminates the less able, less adapted members. And thus the idea of the so-called survival of the fittest, which operates via the elimination of the unfit. And then, of course, the theory of evolution went on to say that by this means each successive generation is slightly superior to the previous one. Its best offspring survive, and their offspring in turn vary slightly. The best of these survive, and so on. We get a progressive improvement, progressive complexity, progressive ability to deal with the environment. Higher and higher type of organisms emerge, and ultimately we reach man. Now, this is the type of theory that Spencer subscribed to. He, by the way, was the one who coined the term survival of the fittest, which Darwin then took over from Spencer. The essence of his idea is that if you leave nature alone to take its course, if you don't interfere with the processes of nature, then by a steady process of evolutionary natural selection, living organisms will be progressively improved. They will reach higher and higher levels as the lower members of each generation are weeded out, so that while nature in effect is cruel to certain living organisms, it's their enemy. In the long run, nature is benevolent because it's guaranteeing by this automatic evolutionary process the progressive improvement of living species. Now, what we're concerned with is Spencer's use of this evolutionary theory as a basis for defending laissez-faire capitalism. Now, he was, I should say, an ardent champion of laissez-faire capitalism, pure laissez-faire capitalism. He did believe in individual rights. He believed that the only proper function of the government was to fight crime, to prevent crime and fight defensive wars. In other words, to defend the rights of individual citizens. He was profoundly opposed to all forms of government interference with the individual. He was opposed to all social welfare legislation, to any form of socialism or government intervention. He even believed that currency should be minted privately, and there should be a private post office. And I should mention that you'd find, if you read him, many good points on individual subjects in his writings. But what we're concerned with here is not the details of his political view, but his basic defense of laissez-faire capitalism. And this is known as social Darwinism. Social Darwinism. In other words, the theory of Darwinian evolutionism applied to society. And here is the basic argument in favor of capitalism. The basic argument is government intervention in the economy interferes with the process of evolution. Nature must be left free to take its course. The law of evolution must be allowed to work on man also. What will happen if we allow it to work? Well, the weak, the unfit will be eliminated. They'll die off. And the strong, the fit, will survive. Progressively, a better and better type of man will emerge, the race will be progressively improved. Whereas if we have government intervention, paternalism, government welfare, and so on, we are flying in the face of nature's laws. We're leading to the degradation of the species, enabling the unfit to survive at the expense of the fit. You imagine, for instance, this is my example, not Spencer's, but imagine, for instance, that we had a group of Christian socialist amoebas way back at the beginning of evolution. And they held the view that you take the weak amoebas and you nurture and love them, and you sacrifice the strong and more adaptable ones to them. Well, obviously, you'd never get the process off the ground then. You'd stop the evolutionary cycle dead. Well, similarly with man, the Spencerians argue. We have to stand aside and stop interfering with the processes of nature. Now, to be sure, says Spencer, this is going to mean a lot of human suffering as the weak perish, as they're shouldered aside in this struggle by the fit. But in the long run, the race, mankind, will benefit. So in the long run, he says, the greatest happiness of the greatest number will be achieved. Yes, if you recognize that phrase, there's a definite element of utilitarianism in Spencer. So you get the idea. There's an inherent conflict or struggle among men between the strong and the weak, the fit and the unfit. And capitalism is defended on the grounds of the survival of the fittest. As far as the unfit are concerned, the Spencerian position is it's too bad for them. That's the law of evolution. Capitalism will necessitate a great deal of severe suffering, but it's temporary and unavoidable, and it's justified by the ultimate welfare of the race which will result. Now let me take a couple of minutes in conclusion simply to say that as a defense of capitalism, this is a disaster. It is so full of holes that you don't know where to start. Let me list a few obvious criticisms, and then we'll call it a night for Spencer. The first thing to note is that even though he talks about individual rights all the time, Spencer's justification of capitalism is a completely collectivistic one. The ultimate standard of value for him is the welfare of mankind, the welfare of the race. The individual is to be left free because that will promote the ultimate welfare of the race. But you see, it's in principle the same type of defense of capitalism as the utilitarians put forth. The same type of altruism. And for the same reasons as we indicated in connection with utilitarianism, it's fundamentally incompatible with the capitalist system. You should know that Spencer is filled with altruistic exhortations. Here's one quote from Spencer just indicating the altruism. This comes at the very conclusion of a book of his called The Principles of Ethics. Quote, "The highest ambition of the beneficent will be to have a share, even though an utterly inappreciable and unknown share, in the making of man. Experience occasionally shows us that there may arise extreme interest in pursuing entirely unselfish ends, and as time goes on, there will be more and more of those whose unselfish end will be the further evolution of humanity. While contemplating from the heights of thought that far-off life of the race never to be enjoyed by them, but only by a remote posterity, they will feel a calm pleasure in the consciousness of having aided the advance towards it." Unquote. And he even argues, I think you see the altruism inherent in that, he even predicts that as evolution progresses, it will modify human nature itself to the point where the individual will find his highest blessedness in self-sacrifice. In other words, he accepts entirely the Christian altruist ethics and the collectivist justification and approach to politics that it entails. Well, that is obviously a setup for the collectivists. They simply come in at this point and say, well, if self-sacrifice is the good, let's start doing it. Let's start now. We don't have to wait for the evolutionary millennium to come. How can you simultaneously say that you should sacrifice for others and accept the principle of inalienable rights? Let's throw out the principle of rights and accept the principle of altruism. And then they proceed to promote their various plans. Now, I think it's clear to this audience that to defend capitalism by reference to an altruist collectivist framework is hopeless. What is the basic error then in Spencer apart from this issue of altruism? In a word, I would say it is his arbitrary application of this whole idea of evolution, the struggle for existence, the survival of the fittest at the expense of the weakest, to man. In this respect, man is fundamentally different from the lower animals. The lower animals have to adapt to the given, whatever is given in their environment. They don't produce wealth, they merely consume what's available. Consequently, they're faced with a static quantity of food. And if there's not enough to go around, the less fit must perish. But man, obviously, as a rational animal, is the productive animal. He's the one that can create wealth by the exercise of his mind, his intelligence. Human beings do not survive by grabbing what they can out of nature in the raw, by shouldering aside the weak. They survive by creating wealth, and there's no limits on the amount of wealth that each man can create by his own effort. In other words, men, metaphysically speaking, are not antagonists, and it is not true that some can survive only at the price of others. No rational human being survives at the expense of anyone else. He produces the goods needed for his own survival and trades his products with the products of others. His whole model of a ruthless struggle in which some are metaphysically doomed to perish is entirely invalid for a productive living entity like man. And further, the very reverse of Spencer's doctrine is true. Suppose you agree to divide men provisionally into the strong and the weak, those of high intelligence, let us say, and those of modest endowment and capacity. Spencer says under capitalism, the weak lose out. They have to give way. But the truth is that only under capitalism do the weak have any chance to survive. And I think that should be obvious. The unfit, by definition, depend upon the productive ability of the strong to survive. By themselves, they can't. What then is the hope of the unfit? Well, only the kind of society which leaves the strong, and I mean here the intellectually strong, free to function. In other words, only capitalism. Because the alternative to that will be some type of slave society in which the competent are shackled and unable to function, and the result is that everybody suffers and perishes. If it's concern for the weak or the less able that motivates a person, then on that ground, if on nothing better, he should defend capitalism also. Now this point is very thoroughly covered in Atlas Shrugged, so I won't elaborate it further. I confine myself to one last brief point. Think of the practical propagandistic effects of the social Darwinist defense of capitalism, because they have been disastrous. This is apart now from its theoretical areas. On the one hand, you have the Marxists, the socialists, the communists, busy for well over a century, spreading the lie that under capitalism only a few can survive and profit, that the weak are doomed to exploitation, suffering, death. Now the great defender of capitalism, Spencer, comes along and says, in effect, true enough, that's how it is, but in the long run the race will be better off. Well, now what effect do you think that's going to have on the average man? He's told on all sides that he can't survive under capitalism, that it's a system for the strong and that he's going to perish under it. He's told that by the enemies of capitalism, and he's told it by its evolutionist defenders. Well, it's not a mystery if then on that ground alone, apart from anything else, he turns against capitalism and utters all these bromides about dog eat dog. Well, we're running considerably over time, so let's conclude our discussion of Spencer. I think you see that I made good my opening promise to show you the stature of the 19th century defenders of capitalism and science. And you are now primed and ready for the 20th century, which we begin next week. Thank you. because we had a short question period, and I'll say a few words briefly about some of them, and then try to get a few from tonight. In any event, I will save the ones, look over them, and if there's any of general interest, I can definitely try to make it shorter next week and have a more extended question period. Here's one that I find from on Comte. Where does Comte get the concept humanity? All we perceive are individuals. Well, that, of course, is certainly true. Comte is entirely inconsistent with his sensualism and positivism. How you can possibly subscribe to the view that mankind is an organism, a giant organism, on the basis of sense experience, you obviously cannot. All we can say is that he himself, at this point, was becoming profoundly romanticist and irrationalist, and was, insofar as he advocated mankind as a collective organism, obviously inconsistent with the basis of his philosophy. Now I have one from last week. In the strict sense in which you used the term, is the body of ideas known as objectivism also a coherent identification of reality, or rather solely a correspondence one? No, as I use the term in the coherence theory of truth, objectivism is not a coherence theory at all. It's a correspondence theory. It holds that truth is correspondence to reality. You must not confuse integration with coherence. To say that we have to arrive at knowledge by relating our ideas, by integrating them systematically, is a question of by what method do we arrive at the truth. And of course, objectivism holds that we have to integrate our ideas non-contradictorily. That is the question of how we arrive at the truth. The question of the theory of truth, though, is what is the meaning of saying that something is true? What is the definition of truth? And the definition of truth is not that your idea coheres with your other ideas, but that your idea corresponds to reality. Now, since reality is consistent and has no contradictions, a set of ideas which correspond to reality will be mutually consistent and integratable. But it does not mean that if you subscribe to the view that your idea should be integrated, you therefore subscribe to the coherence theory of truth. Any brief ones? Try to alternate the two. Where does Marx fit in on the primacy of consciousness versus the primacy of existence issue? Well, since he denies the whole phenomenon of consciousness, he really wouldn't have a viewpoint on this question, because he holds that there is only matter. And consequently, there's no role for consciousness at all on materialist philosophy. Yeah. The utilitarians may object to the charge that hedonism is impossible as a guide to action because it requires the contradiction that pleasure precedes valuing, by pointing out that there are biological given sources of pleasure, namely sensual pleasure such as sex, warmth, and cold, etc. That is true. And that is an amendment I was going to make during the lecture but didn't have time. The argument I gave would still allow for the possibility of physical sensations of pleasure, because they would not as such depend upon our value judgments. There's only a couple points to make in connection with that. To begin with, you must not overrate the significance of physical sensations of pleasure, because an enormous part of the pleasure you experience, even in things which are so-called physical, is a function of evaluative judgments that you make, without which the same physical stimulus would not produce anything like the comparable pleasure. You imagine, for instance, eating dinner in an elegant restaurant, or having the same taste in a charnel house, or a slaughterhouse, etc., where you're swallowing the same food, but obviously the pleasure is enormously different. So one thing I would say is that if you're strictly on the level of physical sensation of pleasure, That is a comparatively very modest phenomenon. Suppose, however, we grant the hedonist that by the way he's set up, he could experience these modest sensations of physical pleasure without value. Then I say the theory loses entirely the faintest shred of plausibility, because what it amounts to is to say that the only justification of action is to produce the kind of pleasure you get when you yawn, when you feel like yawning and then you yawn, or you itch and somebody scratches it, or you're thirsty and somebody takes a drink. That, in other words, a hedonist would be restricted to being able to generate only those values which led to biological sensations of pleasure. And now the whole thing about hedonism is that they're constantly attacked by their opponents on the grounds that they restrict pleasure simply to physical sensations of pleasure, because that's just a completely gratuitous, arbitrary basis for ethics. And the hedonist answer always is this is, and so we recognize the crucial pleasures of creativity, thought, mind, culture, science, and so on. They're the ones that insist most that they don't talk just about the physical sensation of pleasure, but on the point mentioned here, they would be reduced to that position. How do ethical hedonists define the term pleasure? Is this, I think it's instantaneous or integrated over a lifetime, or what? Are the terms happiness and pleasure used interchangeably? Pleasure as an experience is only defined ostensively. That is to say, you simply point to examples. You take a person having an ice cream cone if he likes it, and getting an A in a course, being told that somebody loves him if he wants to be told that. And you give a number of experiences of a person is experiencing pleasure, and you simply point to them and say, he's feeling good, he's enjoying himself, that's pleasure. Is it instantaneous or integrated over a lifetime? Well, any one experience of pleasure lasts for some short period of time, and the ethical hedonists say your idea should be to produce as much pleasure as you can across the long run. If you're an egoistic ethical hedonist, you'll say produce as much pleasure as you can for yourself in the long run. And if you're a utilitarian, you'll say for everyone. Are the terms happiness and pleasure used interchangeably? No. A hedonist will normally define happiness as simply a long-range preponderance of pleasure over pain. If you have a series of comparatively great number of pleasures across a long period of time in relation, and you have a comparatively few pains across that period of time, then the hedonist will say you are happy. Happiness is simply, in effect, a majority of pleasures and a small amount of pain across a long period of time. So it's not that they use the two terms interchangeably, but they do define happiness in terms of a succession of pleasures. Anything else briefly? You object to utilitarianism's determinism that man should want pleasure because by nature he does want pleasure. Isn't it likewise deterministic to say that man should value life because he does value life? Isn't this central to the objectivist view? No, it is not central to the objectivist view. That's precisely why I wanted to stress the utilitarian approach, so when we come to the objectivist approach, you will see how basically different it is. But the objectivist argument is not, I underscore this, I stand on my head to underscore this, the objectivist argument is not, all human beings by nature want to remain alive, therefore life is the standard of value. And one of the key points of objectivism is that it's an achievement to get to the stage where you actually want to live, and that it is not true that this is an automatic, instinctive desire built into all human beings. There is no instinct of self-preservation and no automatic valuing of life. This is, of course, brought out in the character of James Taggart, among others, in Atlas Shrugged. The objectivist argument for life as the standard of value does not depart from the premise, does not take off from the premise all men basically value life. There's an entirely different method of argumentation, which I want to look at when we get there. But for now, simply know that it is not anything modeled on the utilitarian point of view. Here's one on Marxism from last week. The Marxists offer the view of a future world of plenty, but if every man takes only what he needs, all he will take is that which is necessary to keep him alive so he can serve the needs of others. And of course, the implicit objection here is absolutely well taken. It's applicable to any theory of altruism. It would be impossible for everyone consistently to practice altruism. You can make that clear to yourself simply as follows. Imagine that you say to yourself, I want nothing at all for myself. I want only to serve others. And you go to your next door neighbor and you knock on his door. You say, here I am. I'm bereft of all selfish desires. I want nothing but to make you happy. What should I do? The neighbor says, don't tell me. I don't want anything for myself. I have no selfish desires. I want nothing but to promote the welfare of mankind. So let's both of us go next door, etc. Now you see, to go all the way around the globe that way. Put the point another way, before you can have somebody making sacrifices, there's got to be somebody collecting sacrifices. The slogan is, it's better to give than to receive, but there's no giving without somebody receiving. And consequently, complete, systematic, universal self-sacrifice without any recipients is a logical impossibility. Now altruists have recognized this. And consequently, they simply divide human beings up into two types. Those who are justified in receiving the sacrifices and those whose obligation it is to make the sacrifices. And then the different theories of altruism simply disagree with each other on where the split should be made. This is the point that Ayn Rand was making in Atlas Shrugged when she said that altruism involves dividing men into castes, the givers and the receivers. Now, Christianity has one form of the division, see the Sermon on the Mount. Nazism has another form of the same division. Everyone is to sacrifice to the Aryans who are to be the recipients. And communism has another form. Everyone is to sacrifice to the proletarians who are to be the recipients. As to what should happen when you reach the ultimate society, well, I guess everyone is to sacrifice to the welfare of the superorganism, mankind as a whole, which is not any particular individual, but a super totality of a completely mystical kind. But it is true, the implication of this question, that if everyone simply wanted nothing but what he could do for others, it would be impossible to do it. Could you please review why psychological hedonism is incompatible with free will? Well, psychological hedonism can really be interpreted in two ways. If it simply says, as a matter of fact, everybody wants pleasure, but they have a choice about this, then of course it would not be incompatible with free will as such. But in the form in which it's commonly put forth and that I discussed it in the lecture, it says that this is the fundamental motive built into human nature. Now remember, all your actions are determined by your fundamental motives and the knowledge you have in any particular situation. If your fundamental motive is given you by nature, and everything else that you do is done in order to achieve that fundamental object, and you have no choice about that object, then whenever you're in a situation where by your knowledge something leads to that object, you must pursue it. You have no choice. Your motivation is determined. Well, that amounts to then saying that you are completely determined by this motive, which in turn determines all the subsidiary values that you'll hold, and your values determine your actions. In other words, you can have a choice about your actions only if you have a choice about your values. You cannot have, since your actions are determined by your values, judgments. But you can't have a choice about your values if your fundamental value is thrust upon you, because that will then generate the rest of your values and your actions accordingly. How would Comte answer the following? If there are no minds or consciousnesses, who or what perceives the flux of sense data? Well, I don't know how one could answer this. I'm trying to think what Hume would say. You have a flux of sense data, which are not sense data perceived by anyone. So all you could say, I guess, is this: some of those sense data occur in groups and have an aura of consciousness associated with it. So that, for instance, when you now look at this particular sense datum, I'm moving my hand back and forth, you not only see this, you have an experience of awareness of this. And in that case, you have the sense datum of the hand along with the awareness. And I guess that's just part of it, but it's not that there's an entity which is aware. It's just that some sense data are illuminated by an awareness which accompanies them. And that string of a conscious sense data is what you grasp when you introspect. That's the best I can do. But of course the actual answer to the question is that there's nobody to perceive, there can be no perception. You indicated that Comte's defense of altruism was on the basis of religious feelings. Does he take the concept of duty from Kant? Yes. And you say, or is it a type of hedonism whereby religious feelings give pleasure? No. Comte, to my knowledge, was not hedonistic in the way that we discussed tonight. He was a staunch advocate of duty in the Kantian pattern. Did Mill, let's make this the last one, did Mill introduce any qualitative criteria for evaluating pleasures? Yes, that was one of Mill's distinctions from Bentham. Mill said that pleasures differ not only in quantity but in quality. Some are higher or superior or more moral than others. And that therefore when you decide what action to take, you should not try to produce simply the greatest quantity of pleasure, but the greatest quantity in the greatest number of people of the highest quality pleasure. Now that introduced another complicating factor, because on top of intensity, duration, and the rest of them, we have to concern ourselves with the higher quality pleasures. Now, Mill has been criticized for this on the grounds that once he says that two pleasures can be equal in amount and quantity, and nevertheless one can be higher or superior, more valuable than another, he's obviously appealing to some criterion of value other than pleasure. Because he's got two pleasures equal in value, and yet one of them is superior to the other. So he's obviously appealing to some standard other than the hedonistic standard. Bentham was a consistent hedonist. Quantity of pleasure being equal, pushpin is as good as poetry. Mill saying quantity of pleasure being equal, poetry is still better than pushpin. Well, why? By reference to some standard of value other than simply pleasure. And Mill's view that pleasures differ qualitatively rather than just quantitatively is frequently referred to as Mill's heresy to hedonism, because by this method he undercut the basic premise of hedonism. If you ask me how did Mill decide what to regard as a high pleasure or a low pleasure, his only answer, the thought I'll leave you with tonight, is this. He says, you want to decide, simply consult the kind of person who's had experience of both pleasures. And if we find that the majority of people, for instance, who both play pushpin and read poetry, find that they prefer poetry to pushpin, even if they would get as much pleasure from pushpin, but they prefer the poetry, then that makes it a higher pleasure. In other words, this is just a gross appeal to authority. All right, we have run out of time. Thank you.
This course continues with Lecture 7.